In the winter of 1944, a woman in Berlin stood in line for 3 hours to buy half a cabbage. When she finally reached the front, she thanked the shopkeeper, tucked the vegetable under her coat, and walked home through streets that looked almost normal. Trams rattled past. Children hurried to school. A cinema marquee advertised the week's film. And yet, somewhere deep in the bones of this ancient city, something was breaking apart. This is not a story about armies or battles. This is a story about bread lines and basement shelters, about mothers making impossible choices and strangers sharing their last cigarettes. This is the story of what happens when a great city begins to die and its people must decide, hour by hour, how to keep living. If these stories of human endurance resonate with you, consider subscribing to this channel. Here, history is told through the lives of ordinary people who faced extraordinary pressure. Berlin in early 1944 still wore the mask of a functioning capital. The machinery of daily existence continued to turn, even as the gears began to grind. Government offices opened at 8 in the morning. Factory whistles summoned workers to their shifts. Housewives planned meals around the official ration cards that promised precise allotments of bread, meat, and sugar, even when the shelves held less than the cards allowed. The city had been at war for nearly 5 years, and its residents had learned to adapt. They had grown accustomed to the blackout curtains that transformed every window into a dark rectangle after sunset. They had memorized the locations of the nearest air raid shelters, the quickest routes from home to safety. They had learned to sleep lightly, ears tuned to the distant wail of sirens. But in the early months of that year, many Berliners still believed the disruption was temporary. The propaganda posters that covered every available surface spoke of wonder weapons and coming victories. The radio broadcasts maintained their tone of confident certainty, and in the privacy of their kitchens and bedrooms, people clung to the hope that normalcy would somehow return. The ration system had become the central organizing principle of civilian life. Each family received cards that entitled them to specific quantities of food and goods, a bureaucratic attempt to distribute scarcity fairly. In practice, obtaining rations required hours of waiting, a network of relationships with shopkeepers, and constant vigilance. A rumor that a particular store had received a shipment of potatoes could send dozens of women hurrying through the streets, joining lines that stretched around corners. Children adapted in their own ways. Schools continued to operate, though the curriculum had long since bent to the demands of the state. Young students practiced air raid drills alongside their arithmetic. They learned to identify aircraft by silhouette, to distinguish between the drone of friendly engines and the deeper rumble of bombers from the west. For many children, the war was simply the texture of existence, the only world they had ever known. The nights brought fear that daylight could temporarily dispel. When darkness fell and the blackout descended, Berlin became a city of shadows. Families gathered around radios, listening for news, waiting for the sirens. When the alert came, they would move quickly, methodically, having rehearsed the choreography countless times. Blankets and water jugs and identity papers, all kept ready by the door. The descent into cellars and shelters. The long hours of waiting, listening to the muffled thunder above. By morning, the all-clear would sound, and people would emerge to assess the damage. Some nights brought only the whistle of aircraft passing overhead, bound for other targets. Other nights left craters in familiar streets, turned buildings into hollowed shells. Berliners developed a vocabulary for destruction. A building that had lost its facade, but still stood, was different from one that had collapsed entirely. A street rendered impassable was different from one merely littered with glass. The cleanup began immediately. Work crews appeared to clear rubble from major thoroughfares. Utility workers labored to restore severed gas and water lines. And ordinary citizens picked through the debris of their own homes, salvaging what could be saved, mourning what could not. Then they went to work. They stood in ration lines. They continued living because the alternative was unthinkable. What made this period particularly strange was the coexistence of destruction and routine. A woman might spend her morning clearing bricks from her apartment stairwell, and her afternoon attending a chamber music concert. A man might walk past the smoking ruins of a department store on his way to his regular chess game at a cafe that still served ersatz coffee. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization, for maintaining islands of normalcy in a rising sea of chaos. Entertainment continued, though it took on a peculiar quality. Cinemas showed approved films to audiences who sought a few hours of escape. Theaters mounted productions, though the performers might be called upon to double as air raid wardens. Cabarets still operated in basements, their humor grown darker, their audiences laughing at jokes they might have wept over in peacetime. Religion offered another refuge. Churches remained open, their congregations swelling with people seeking comfort that official channels could not provide. Priests and pastors offered what solace they could, their sermons walking a careful line between faith and the political realities that surrounded them. Many families who had drifted from regular worship found themselves returning, drawn by a need for community and meaning that transcended doctrine. The city's population had changed dramatically. Many native Berliners had sent their children to the countryside through official evacuation programs, trying to put distance between their families and the nightly raids. In their place came refugees from the Eastern Territories, families who had fled approaching dangers with little more than the clothes they wore and the stories they carried. They crowded into camps and temporary shelters, their presence a reminder of what might lie ahead. These refugees brought news that official sources did not share. They spoke of what they had seen, what they had endured, what they had left behind. Their accounts passed through the city in whispers, in conversations held away from official ears. For many Berliners, these stories were the first cracks in the wall of certainty, the first suggestions that the future might hold something other than the promised victory. And still the rituals of daily life continued. Births were registered, marriages were performed, funerals processed through streets where craters had been hastily filled. The mail still arrived, though letters from the front came less frequently, and the ones that did arrive often contained phrases that families had learned to decode. Everyone was well. Spirits were high. The weather was difficult. The gaps between these sparse sentences held everything that could not be written. Spring came, and with it a brief softening of the world. Trees budded in the parks that had not been destroyed. Flowers appeared in window boxes and small gardens, bright assertions of life against the gray backdrop of damage. People turned their faces toward the sun during their lunch breaks, storing warmth against the darkness they knew would return. In these months, it was still possible to believe, to hope, to trust that somehow, some way, the worst would not come. The machinery of daily life had bent, but not broken. The ration lines were longer, but still moved. The shelters were crowded, but still held. And in 10,000 small ways, the people of Berlin demonstrated that most human of qualities, the stubborn insistence on continuing, even when the path ahead had disappeared into shadow. They could not know, in those final months of relative normalcy, how completely their world was about to change. They could not know that the lines they stood in, the shelters they descended into, the routines they maintained with such determination, were the last fragments of an order about to collapse entirely. They knew only that today required their attention, their endurance, their hope. And so they gave it, as people always have, as people always will, when civilization begins to unravel around them. There is a moment in every crisis when the rules that once governed life simply stop applying. In Berlin, that moment arrived not as a single event, but as an accumulation, a slow drowning in which each day brought the water a little higher. By autumn of 1944, the rituals that had sustained the city began to fail, and its people found themselves navigating a world where the old certainties no longer held. The air raids had changed. What had once been periodic disruptions became a relentless drumbeat. The sirens that had wailed perhaps twice a week now sounded night after night, sometimes multiple times in a single evening. Sleep became a fragmented thing, stolen in the brief hours between alerts. Families developed a kind of exhausted automatism, descending to their shelters without fully waking, huddling in the darkness until the all-clear allowed them to climb back to beds that might no longer exist. The shelters themselves had become a second home for many. Public bunkers, basement cellars, subway tunnels, these underground spaces developed their own social structures and unwritten rules. Families claimed regular spots, arranging their blankets and provisions in the same corner night after night. Strangers became familiar faces, their fears and habits known through the intimacy of shared confinement. In some shelters, informal committees emerged to manage ventilation, to settle disputes, to care for the elderly and the very young. But the shelters could not protect against everything. Some were hit directly, their concrete walls cracking under impacts they were never designed to withstand. Others became traps when the buildings above collapsed, sealing the exits with tons of rubble. The mathematics of survival became a constant calculation. Which shelter was safest? Which route offered the best chance of reaching it in time? At what point did the danger of the streets outweigh the danger of remaining at home? Above ground, the city was being slowly erased. Entire neighborhoods disappeared over the course of weeks, their apartment blocks reduced to hollow facades and piles of brick. Landmarks that had oriented generations of Berliners ceased to exist. Streets became unrecognizable, their familiar shapes obscured by craters and debris. People who had lived in the same district their entire lives found themselves lost in a landscape of destruction. The infrastructure that made urban life possible began to fail. Water mains, ruptured by explosions, left entire blocks without running water. Families learned to collect rainwater, to melt snow, to queue at emergency distribution points where trucks delivered barrels to crowds of women carrying every available container. Gas lines fractured and could not be repaired, leaving kitchens cold. Electrical service became sporadic, then rare, and in some areas non-existent. Without utilities, the most basic tasks became monumental challenges. Cooking required fuel that had to be scavenged from the wreckage-splintered furniture, broken doors, anything that would burn. Keeping warm in the approaching winter meant huddling together under every available blanket, burning whatever could be spared, insulating shattered windows with cardboard and rags. Personal cleanliness, once a matter of simple routine, became a luxury that required planning and effort. The food situation deteriorated from difficult to desperate. Official rations, already inadequate, became theoretical promises that the broken distribution system could not fulfill. Shops that had struggled to maintain minimal stock now stood empty, their proprietors having nothing to sell. The careful calculations that housewives had made, this much bread must last until Tuesday. These potatoes must stretch for 3 more days, collapsed when the expected supplies simply did not arrive. A shadow economy emerged from the ruins. A black market, which had existed throughout the war years, now became essential for survival. In parks and alleyways, in the back rooms of damaged buildings, transactions took place that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. Wedding rings exchanged for butter, family silver traded for a few pounds of flour. Heirlooms that had passed through generations surrendered for enough food to see a family through another week. The currency of this underground economy was not money, but goods. Reichsmarks had lost their meaning in a world where there was nothing to buy. Cigarettes became the universal medium of exchange, their value stable when all other values had collapsed. A carton of cigarettes could purchase food, medicine, services, information. Those who did not smoke hoarded them anyway, knowing they represented a security that paper currency could no longer provide. Families faced decisions that no one should have to make. With transportation systems failing and the Eastern Front drawing closer, the question of evacuation became urgent. But evacuation meant separation. It meant sending children away to uncertain destinations, to relatives who might or might not be able to care for them. to countryside villages that might or might not be safer than the burning city. Mothers stood on train platforms, pressing their children close, not knowing if they would ever see them again. The elderly often refused to leave. For those who had spent their entire lives in Berlin, who had raised families in apartments now reduced to rubble, the idea of flight was worse than the reality of danger. They had survived one war, then peace, then another war. They would survive this too, or they would die in the only place they had ever called home. These decisions were not made from ignorance, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what mattered most. Trust, that invisible fabric that holds communities together, began to fray. The desperation of circumstances drove some to inform on neighbors for small advantages, an extra ration card, a safer work assignment, the removal of a rival for scarce resources. Others simply withdrew, focusing all their remaining energy on their immediate families, unable to spare concern for anyone beyond their own doors. The communal spirit that had characterized the early shelter experiences gave way, in some cases, to suspicion and self-protection. Yet even as society strained, acts of unexpected kindness persisted. A baker who still had flour shared his last loaves with families he knew were starving. A doctor made rounds through the ruins, treating the injured without asking for payment she knew no one could provide. Strangers helped strangers dig through rubble, searching for survivors they had never met. The same pressure that brought out the worst in some brought out the best in others. News from beyond the city filtered through, despite every effort to control it. Refugees continued to arrive from the east, their numbers growing, their stories more urgent. They spoke of what followed in the wake of advancing armies, of the fate that awaited those who could not flee. These accounts spread through the city in whispers, in glances, in the particular silence that fell when certain topics arose. The propaganda still insisted on victory, but fewer and fewer believed. The fabric of time itself seemed to change. Days blurred together in an exhausting sameness of survival tasks. Queue for water, search for food, repair what could be repaired, descend to the shelter, wait for the all clear, emerge to assess new damage, begin again. The future, which had once extended forward in a comprehensible way plans for next month, next year, the children's education, retirement, had contracted to a single overwhelming question: how to survive until tomorrow. Winter arrived with particular cruelty. The cold penetrated buildings whose walls had been breached, whose windows had been blasted out, whose heating systems had long since failed. Fuel of any kind became precious beyond measure. Families burned furniture, books, anything combustible. They slept together in single rooms, pooling body heat. They watched the elderly and the very young for signs of hypothermia, knowing that medical help, if it came at all, came slowly. In this compressed world of immediate survival, some found unexpected reserves of strength. Women who had spent their lives in domestic roles became the primary providers, navigating the black market, negotiating with officials, making decisions that determined whether their families lived or died. Children grew old beyond their years, taking on responsibilities that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. The old hierarchies and expectations crumbled, replaced by the simple imperative of endurance. And still, improbably, life continued. Babies were born in cellars during air raids, their first breaths drawn in the dusty air of underground shelters. Couples married in brief ceremonies between alerts, exchanging vows before witnesses who might not survive to remember them. People fell ill and recovered, or fell ill and did not. The essential human experiences continued even as the structures that normally contained them collapsed. By the early months of 1945, Berlin had become a city transformed. The confident capital of just a year earlier had given way to something more primitive, a landscape of ruins inhabited by exhausted survivors, focused entirely on the elemental needs of food, water, warmth, and shelter. The question was no longer when normalcy would return, but whether it would return at all, and if so, what form it might take in a world that had been so completely unmade. The pressure had arrived, and the people of Berlin had reacted as people always react when civilization fails them. Some had broken, some had bent, and some had discovered, in the crucible of extremity, a strength they had never known they possessed. What came next would test them all in ways that even the terrible winter had not prepared them for. In the final weeks, Berlin became a city of cellars. The world above had grown too dangerous for prolonged habitation, too unpredictable for anything resembling normal movement. Families descended into basements and bunkers, and stayed there emerging only when absolute necessity demanded it, to search for water to confirm that their buildings still stood, to scavenge whatever food might be found in the wreckage of a dying city. The underground spaces that had once served as temporary refuges became permanent dwellings. Entire communities existed below street level, their days measured not by sunlight, but by the rhythm of explosions above. Candles and oil lamps provided the only illumination. Air grew thick and stale. Sanitation facilities, never adequate, failed entirely. Disease spread through crowded shelters, claiming those whose weakened bodies could no longer resist. Children who had once played in parks and courtyards now knew only the confines of basement walls. They invented games that could be played in darkness and silence. They learned to sleep through sounds that would have terrified adults in peacetime. Some developed a strange calm, an acceptance of circumstances that disturbed their parents more than fear would have. Others could not adapt, their nights filled with terrors that no comfort could quiet. The city's geography had become a maze of danger. Streets that appeared passable might be watched by those who would shoot anyone who moved. Buildings that seemed stable might collapse without warning. The simple act of crossing from one cellar to another required careful timing, local knowledge, and no small amount of luck. Neighbors developed systems of signals a certain knock, a particular pattern of taps on pipes, to communicate without exposing themselves. Food had become the organizing principle of existence. Whatever reserves families had hoarded were long exhausted. The official distribution system had ceased to function entirely. Survival now depended on what could be found in the ruins. A forgotten sack of grain in a bombed warehouse, vegetables from gardens that no one tended anymore, the meat of animals that had once been pets or working horses. Hunger became a constant companion, shaping every decision, every movement, every calculation. Water presented its own desperate challenge. The mains had failed weeks earlier. Rivers and canals, contaminated by debris and worse, offered dangerous alternatives. Rain barrels and collected snowmelt provided what purity was available. Families learned to filter, to boil when fuel could be found, to ration every precious drop. Thirst could drive people to risks that hunger alone might not have justified. In this extremity, the social order that had governed the city for generations completed its collapse. The hierarchies of class and status that had once determined who spoke to whom, who lived where, who merited respect, all of it dissolved in the equality of desperation. A factory owner's family huddled beside a street sweeper's widow, sharing the same fear, breathing the same stale air, hoping for the same unlikely salvation. Women emerged as the primary architects of survival, with most men absent gone to fronts from which they would not return, or too old or too young for the demands of this new world. Women took command of circumstances that would have been unthinkable in their former lives. They made decisions about when to venture out and when to stay hidden. They negotiated with whatever authorities still existed. They organized the sharing of resources among families who had once been strangers. When the immediate danger passed, these same women led the work of emergence. They climbed from the cellars into a landscape of total devastation, a city that bore almost no resemblance to the one they had known. Block after block reduced to rubble, landmarks erased, streets impassable. The scale of destruction exceeded anything that imagination could have prepared them for. And yet, almost immediately, the work of reconstruction began. The women who came to be known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rebel women, started the task of clearing the debris by hand. They formed human chains, passing bricks from one to another, sorting the salvageable from the destroyed. They worked without adequate tools, without proper equipment, without any of the resources that such a massive undertaking would normally require. They worked because no one else would, because the alternative was to simply give up, because their children needed somewhere to live. The physical labor was staggering. Estimates suggest that the destruction had created hundreds of millions of cubic meters of rubble, a mountain of debris that seemed beyond any human capacity to move. But day after day, week after week, the women continued. Their hands bled, their backs ached. Their exhaustion reached depths that peacetime life could never have imagined. And slowly, brick by brick, the city began to change. The immediate aftermath brought new hardships, even as it ended old ones. Food remained desperately scarce. Clean water was still difficult to obtain. Medical care was almost non-existent for civilians. Diseases swept through the weakened population. The death toll continued to climb even after the fighting had stopped, claimed by hunger and illness and injuries that could not be treated. Yet amidst this ongoing suffering, small mercies appeared. Strangers shared their last provisions with families they had never met. Former enemies, in some cases, showed unexpected kindness. International aid began to trickle in inadequate to the need, but a sign that the world beyond the ruins had not forgotten them entirely. The brutal isolation of the final weeks gave way to the first tentative connections with a larger humanity. Families began the agonizing process of searching for the missing. The war had scattered people across continents, evacuated children, displaced refugees, prisoners, the simply lost. Networks emerged to help the separated find each other. Names were posted on walls, on bulletin boards, anywhere that someone searching might see them. The Red Cross compiled lists, processed inquiries, tried to match the lost with those who sought them. Some reunions brought joy that defied description. Children who had been sent away returned to parents who had spent months not knowing if they would ever see them again. Husbands and wives, separated by circumstance, found each other against all probability. These moments of recovery, witnessed by neighbors who shared in the emotion, reminded the survivors why they had endured it all. But many searches ended differently. The lists of the dead grew longer. The missing remained missing. The hoped-for letters never arrived. Families who had maintained hope through the darkest months finally had to accept that hope was all they would ever have. The grief of these realizations spread through the recovering city, a quiet devastation that left no visible scars. The rebuilding proceeded unevenly. Some neighborhoods recovered faster than others. Some families found their footing, while others continued to struggle. The inequities of the pre-war world did not disappear. They simply took new forms. Those who had connections, resources, luck found their way more quickly. Those without these advantages remained in the rubble longer, recovered more slowly, bore the scars more visibly. Children who had survived the cellars emerged into a childhood unlike any that had come before. They played in ruins that had once been homes. They collected shrapnel as other children might collect stones or stamps. They had seen things and known things that children should not see or know. How this shaped them, the adults they would become, the society they would build, remained to be seen. The women who had cleared the rubble, who had held their families together through the worst, who had made the impossible decisions that survival required, gradually returned to lives that resembled the ones they had known before, or did not return. For some, the experience had changed them too profoundly for any return. They had discovered capabilities within themselves, had taken on roles and responsibilities that the old order would never have permitted. The world that emerged from the ruins would bear their imprint. Berlin's survival was not heroic in any storybook sense. There were no triumphant moments, no clear victories, no enemies defeated through courage alone. There was only endurance, the accumulated weight of a million small decisions to continue living, to protect the vulnerable, to preserve some fragment of humanity amid the collapse of everything that had once seemed permanent. What remains of this story is not a tale of glory, but a record of human resilience at its most fundamental. It is a reminder that civilizations do not collapse in a single dramatic moment. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, and ordinary people must find their way through each fraying strand. The people of Berlin in those final months were not exceptional. They were teachers and shopkeepers and mothers and children. They were people who wanted only to survive, to see their families safe, to have enough to eat and a place to sleep.